Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. Welcome back. This is yet another edition of the GLC at Lunch. We've got a great audience today. Thanks to all of you for coming. I want to thank Hira Jaffe for choosing the music today, which is T for Two by Art Tatum. That was an amazing keyboard we heard. Thank you, Hira. That was wonderful. Anyways, my great pleasure to introduce Isabela Fraga. You can join us now and hit your video if you want. There you are. Okay. Isabela is a current 1-month fellow here at the GLC. She's just finished her first year teaching at Tufts University in the Department of Spanish and Romance Languages. She just also before that did a postdoc at Stanford for 2 years, I think. And before that did her PhD at the University of Chicago. Her BA and MA are from Brazil, which is her native country. She grew up in Brazil. Her work, we're going to hear all about today, it comes from her first book that she is currently writing, called Bound to Feel, Personhood from Slavery to Abolition in Brazil and Cuba, which makes, of course, a natural, obvious, and wonderful comparison across at least 2 languages. And I must say, this is a subject, this world of the interior world of people on both sides of slavery, fits for historians into what tends to be called now the history of emotions. Now, I don't know, and Isabela will tell us just how much that equates to the way this is studied in literature. But it's a fascinating new field for historians. And without further ado, Isabela, welcome to the GLC and to Yale in springtime, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, David, for this generous introduction. And thank you also, everybody at the center, Michelle Zacks, Melissa McGrath, Tamara Michelle, and everybody that has been very welcoming to me here in this month that I'm very grateful to have to do some research and writing as the teaching semester ends. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see this? Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
great.
Looks good.
Great. Okay, so as David said, my talk today is based on my current book project, Bound to Feel, Personhood from Slavery to Abolition in Brazil and Cuba. And this is a provisional title, and hopefully we'll see how it goes in the next couple of years as I work on this. So as David's kind of suggested before I started, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am not a historian by training. I'm a literary and cultural studies scholar whose work tends to focus a lot on material that one finds in historical archives. That said, I am heavily informed by the discipline of history and by historiography, and I'm always in conversation, happily in conversation with historians, but I think that my approach is a bit different, as you will see, and I'm happy to talk about the pitfalls and dangers and problems with that, which is looking at those historical materials more as objects of textual and sometimes visual analysis rather than evidence for a broader historiographical argument. Obviously, those things are blurry, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A as well. Okay, so let me just give you a quick roadmap for the next 30 to 35 minutes. I'm going to start with a story from my archival research that's gonna, I hope, introduce the main themes and concepts that I will be delving more deeply in the talk. Then I'll explain the book project as a whole, and then zoom into one of the chapters to give you an actual idea of my approach and the kind of analysis that I do with those historical materials. And this is going to be very historically heavy in terms of the material that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so on the kind of case study that I would like to open is something that I found in the Matanzas Provincial Archive in Cuba. It's about an afternoon in August in 1843 when the enslaved Juan Maria and Jose Carabalí were working on a charcoal pile in Matanzas. And this charcoal pile was owned by their enslaver, Ambrosio González de Chávez. And at some point in that afternoon, Juan went to the paddock. And when he came back to the charcoal pile, Jose was no longer there. And looking and calling for him, Juan finally went to the chicken coop and he found Jose's body hanging from the rafters. So Jose had committed suicide. I should have added a content warning here. There's going to be some mentions of suicide throughout this talk. So Juan reported the incident to their enslaver, who then communicated it to the local authorities. And then an investigation followed to determine the causes of the incident, and which in their view was, had Jose Carabalí been severely punished or mistreated by his enslaver, or was he sick, had he some sort of illness? And according to the investigation, there was nothing particularly or material or concrete that justified Jose Carabalí's suicide. The physician who took part in this investigation wrote, and I'm quoting here the document, he did not lack food or clothes. Neither did local authorities find evidence of bad treatment or disease. With no material cause in their eyes, then they all turned to speculating about Jose Carabalí's inner life, his thoughts, his feelings, his beliefs. Ultimately, they concluded that it was la voluntad del negro, or the slave's will, that had driven Carabalí to suicide. Such voluntad, or such will, was, and I'm quoting what is there on the slide, was the belief that all captives who hang or die go back to their homeland. In other words, the Matanzas authorities determined that Jose Carabalí's death was the result of his will and belief in the transmigration of his soul and perhaps body to his kin and land. So as I said, I found this case while doing archival research in Cuba in 2017, and his death, Jose Carabalí's death, was one of the 1,171 deaths by suicide among the enslaved population in Cuba from 1839 to 1845, as per the records of the island's Western Department. And Jose Carabalí's voluntary death and the puzzlement that it caused among colonial authorities point to the intangible, subjective processes that undergirded 19th century racial slavery in the Americas. So throughout the Iberian colonial project and beyond, actually, conjectures on the subjectivity of the other, particularly when this other was deemed spiritually or racially different, or both, as it was the case here, was a foundational element of chattel slavery. And this question, this idea, right, of this speculation about the subjectivity or the thoughts and feelings of this racially, spiritually different other forms the core of my study of this research that I'm doing here. So in the book, Bound to Feel, Personhood from Slavery to Abolition in Brazil and Cuba, I examined two interconnected phenomena. First, I inquire on how insubordinate action by enslaved subjects, such as committing suicide, beating up their enslaver, or refusing to work, prompted enslavers and imperial authorities to speculate, imagine, or to produce some sort of knowledge about the inner lives of the enslaved, that is, their feelings, their thoughts, like they did with Jose Carabalí. Second, I also ask how enslaved and formerly enslaved individuals responded to this investment in their own subjectivities. And in this part, I look mostly into lyric poetry and autobiographical writings, where enslaved and formerly enslaved authors made their own interventions into what that was then becoming a culture of feeling that permeated 19th century Cuban and Brazilian societies. And in so doing, they articulated specific conceptions of bondage and emancipation that challenged the dominant affective registers of the time. And by that, I mean the social norms or expectations about emotions and feelings that were governing society at the time.
Excuse me, Isabella?
Yeah.
It's Michelle. I think your slides are not advancing.
Oh, shoot. Wait, let me see what I can do. Thank you for telling me. Let me see if I can do it in a different way.
Here, I don't know if you have any recommendations.
Let me try this. I'm going to try to share my screen again. You can see now, right? And I can just... Is this working?
Yes.
Yes, okay, let me change it. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, okay, so I was here. Those are the main
Thank
main
you.
claims. Sorry that if you were talking to me on the chat, I wasn't seeing. Yeah. Okay. So those are the two main questions that I'm asking in the book. How enslavers imagine, depict, and manage the inner lives of the enslaved and formerly enslaved in Cuba and Brazil, and how the enslaved and formerly enslaved respond to this investment in their subjectivities. Okay, so the kind of interventions that I'm hoping this project will make, there is obviously a lot of work on slavery and the history of emotions in slavery, as David was mentioning. But a lot of that work tends to focus on bodily suffering, right? And in this project, I shift the focus to the representation of the enslaved mind. So I'm interested in those aspects of experience that left no visible scars or nothing to be painted or photographed to move abolitionist audiences at home or abroad in the 19th century. But it was precisely those invisible parts, right? The mind, the soul, the heart, that reformers and abolitionists often try to reach. And I'm thinking here about classic abolitionist discourse, 18th, 19th century. And their goal was to show that enslaved Africans and their descendants were fully human and not things or commodities. And you can think about the emblem, right? Am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a woman and a sister? And this impulse, of course, did not disappear with abolition. And much of the scholarship in the 20th and 21st centuries has inherited the same goal, to show on one hand how slavery and anti-Blackness dehumanizes people, and on the other, to affirm the full humanity of those who were enslaved. But many scholars in different disciplines, and I'm mentioning here just a few, but there are many more, Sadie Hardman, Walter Johnson, Sidney Chalhoub, Moreno Fraginal, Zakaya, Iman Jackson, remind us that slavery did not just rely on denying humanity or the dehumanization of the enslaved. It also depended on recognizing their humanity, albeit many times partially. Enslavers commodified people, of course, but that commodification was never total. They needed their captives to be human, whether for labor, for negotiation, or even in the context of coerced intimacy. And that raises a question that is important for me, right? What did enslavers see or use in that humanity, and what qualities did they count on? What human qualities did they count on? So what I hope for is that this project enters this conversation by looking at feeling as one of those core human capacities that enslavers relied on, not just in terms of emotion or intimacy, but as a broader capacity to be moved or to affect and to be affected by others. And I'm thinking here of everything from spiritual sensibility to aesthetic refinement, right? All of this is encompassed in this umbrella term that I call feeling. In other words, understand feeling here as a disputed property that could confer value or legitimacy to certain discursive practices or social and racial groups. So in the project, I argued that feeling was central, not only to the way enslavers pursued their economic and ideological goals, but also to how abolitionists shaped their arguments and how enslaved peoples themselves experienced captivity and freedom. So in terms of structure, I'm not going to go far into this, just so you have an idea. The book is structured into 4 chapters, each exploring a different discourse or field of knowledge related to the inner lives of enslaved and free Africans and Afro-descendants in Brazil and Cuba. And of course, the fact that it's Brazil and Cuba makes it really hard to condense into only 4 chapters. But this is something that I'm dealing with right now. So following with the thread, and this is the introduction, right, that begins with the enslaved as subjects of the Catholic Church, I show how the religious discourses changed during the expansion of the slave trade in the late 18th century, developing into a particular rhetoric of feeling and sentiment in the mid-19th century, and particularly in medical, literary, and legal discourses. And those are the focus of chapters 1, 2, and 3, as you can see there. And this rhetoric of feeling, then, I argue, paved the way for anthropology and also psychiatry to portray the subjectivities of the newly freed population in the aftermath of abolition as particularly prone to madness or crime. So this is the focus of chapter 4, the last chapter, which encompasses the years right after abolition in Brazil and Cuba, the decades right after abolition, I mean. But today I want to focus on the 3rd chapter of my project, the one that I began developing after defending the dissertation. So it's very much a work in progress at this point. And also the one for which my time here at the GLC has been and will continue to be in this month very, very important and crucial. As it deals with legal discourse, as you can see, particularly freedom suits that were litigated in the mid-19th century, which most scholars have worked as evidence of enslaved people's complex experiences with freedom, ownership, and agency. So my work builds on these studies and it's in conversation with the studies, but takes a slightly different approach. So rather than reading these freedom suits primarily as evidence of enslaved people's agency or legal acumen, I focus instead on the affective and syntactical strategies, and I'm talking here about syntax or about language, and that the enslaved and their advocates used to navigate the blurry boundary between slavery and freedom. In the case that I'm going to talk about today, the strategy is the focus on a specific clause of a will. And I will argue that this specific clause produced conceptions about property status and personhood through an affirmation of an affective bond, of an imagined affective bond between enslaved and enslaver, which I think highlights this incomplete and very perverse process of commodification that is imbued in the institution of slavery. And ultimately, I hope that this work will contribute to very important research that has been done by scholars such as Michelle McKinley, Adriana Chira, Cindy Chalou, Bianca Premo, Aisnara Pereira Diaz, and Maria de los Angeles Merino Fuentes, who showed that slavery and freedom were not an either-or sort of binary, but rather a much more ambiguous and nebulous terrain. So as many of you know, unlike the United States, enslaved peoples in Iberian colonies were inscribed into legal codes such as the Siete Partidas, as you can see here, which was a 13th century body of law first compiled during the reign of Alfonso X, which came to regulate the institution of slavery in Iberian territories. That meant that, albeit very inconsistently and precariously, enslaved men and women resorted to courts and legal paths in order to either change masters or to obtain their own manumission or the manumission of debts of their kin. And historians have shown that women were the majority of these litigants in many of those territories, particularly in Cuba, and particularly the ones who actually succeeded in obtaining freedom. In Cuba, these petitions were typically mediated by a síndico procurador who represented the enslaved person in the legal system, as captives did not officially have legal personality. And as Adriana Chira has argued, however, enslaved peoples in Cuba treated the law as a continuation of the social field rather than a completely separate technical realm, particularly in Santiago de Cuba, which is where the suit that I'm analyzing here today is from. So Santiago de Cuba, as you may know, is on the eastern portion of the island, which is a bit far from Havana, which was the center of colonial power, which is kind of over here. So this means that even though there were relatively few freedom suits in Santiago de Cuba, we should approach them, and I'm quoting Chira here, as texts that show how an idiom of entitlement permeated social life beyond the courts and was part of everyday negotiations, rather than focus on enslaved people's limited direct engagement with the courts. So in mid-19th century Cuba, these petitions and suits followed a fairly conventional path. First, the síndico, procurador, usually a white Creole man, and the accompanying attorney filed a petition demanding the captive's manumission and naming the acusado, or the defendant, who was usually the enslaver or the slave owner, who would then write a response rebutting the claim made by the síndico. So it was a sort of a fraught conversation, right? And as Aisnara Pereira Diaz and Maria de los Angeles have shown, most freedom suits fell under 6 specific claims. The first one, money. So usually the amount that was agreed upon for manumission or the price for coartación. Conditions and promises of manumission, protection, possession, and prescription. So this typically involved individuals who claimed illegal enslavement or whose rights had been violated. Prostitution, casuistic procedures, so such as specific laws that granted manumission to certain groups of enslaved peoples, and then travels to the so-called free lands, right? So territories where slaves had been abolished, such as Spain or Britain. And many times those matters were solved extrajudicially, but in other cases, a judge had to come in and intervene and assess the situation and issue an official ruling, either granting or denying manumission sought by the enslaved person. The case that I'm examining here today falls into the latter group, that is, it required a ruling by a judge. And it fits between the second and third of this kind of categorization of cases, conditions and promises of manumission and protection, possession, and prescription. And the litigant was a 15-year-old girl named Caridad, who petitioned for manumission based on her mother Dorotea's successful freedom suit more than a decade earlier. So Dorotea's case went on from 1842 to 1854, which means that Dorotea received her manumission just 2 years before Caridad started her own litigation in 1856. Caridad appears in the suit as La Mulatica Caridad, hija de la Negra Dorotea. So right here on the first lines, the petition offers an insight into the practice of the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, which established that the legal status of the children would follow that of their mother. And as a key element to the reproductive logic of slavery, the partus principle appears here, and I'm quoting Jennifer Morgan, inseparable from explanatory power of race. So the document identifies Dorotea, the mother, as negra and Caridad as mulatica. And the choice to describe Caridad as mulatica denotes not only that she was young, so you have the diminutive ica, right? But also that she's the product of an interracial, perhaps coerced relationship, right? And in Caridad's suit, it says that her biological father was a plantation administrator. And I would just like to take a moment here to send my profound thanks to Maria de los Angeles Merino Fuentes and Aisnara Pereira Diaz, because I found out about Caridad's case through their incredible book, Estrategias de Libertad. And I was in Cuba last summer looking for cases like this and that one and the full case, and they were crucial in helping me navigate the Archivo Nacional and finding more cases like that. So this is all because of them, basically. So in 1842, Dorotea had initiated a civil suit against her then enslaver, Juan Bautista Megre. So Dorotea's case is this on the right, based on the stipulation of the will of Juan Bautista's father, Julian Megre. Julian Megre was a planter from Saint Domingue. So you have here starting to see a few of the names that I'm mentioning. So Julian Megre was a planter from Saint Domingue who, like many others, had settled in Cuba, fleeing the Haitian Revolution. The clause in Julian Megre's will specified that upon his death, Dorotea, who was then a young girl, was to remain with Juan Bautista Megre until she reached the age of 25, the so-called mayoredad. At that point, she would receive a manumission letter, provided that she behaved well and maintained good reputation. And we will get to that in a second. In other words, if Dorotea behaved in their eyes poorly upon turning 25, she would be treated as part of Julian Megre's other assets, and her value would be shared with his heirs. When Julian Megre passed away, so when this patriarch, Julian Megre, passed away, a coffee planter, Dorotea thus came under the care of Juan Bautista Megre, his son. However, in 1842, a month before she turned 25, Juan Bautista sold Dorotea to a man called Melchor Catazus. At this point, Dorotea had just given birth to Caridad and was on the verge of receiving her manumission letter. Since the sale would prevent her from obtaining manumission, Dorotea fled the Megre coffee plantation where she lived to the town of Santiago de Cuba and approached the Síndico Procurador General, who opened a petition for her promised manumission. So in Dorotea's lawsuit, both parties debated whether she had indeed fulfilled the conditions stipulated in the will, buena conducta y reputación, so good behavior and reputation. In 1854, after a decade of litigation that involved the testimonies of more than 16 witnesses, Juan Bautista Megre, the living son, finally agreed to give Dorotea her manumission letter. So Dorotea's case, was a clear-cut case of conditional manumission by grace, which was considered a gift or donation from the enslaver to the enslaved, based on an abstract idea of merit and on an alleged and imagined affective relationship between them. In other words, an important element in Dorotea's case, which was exploited by her Síndico Procurador, was Julian Megre's supposed fondness of her, which would have led him to grant her manumission or conditional manumission. Dorotea's daughter Caridad, however, remained enslaved to Melchor Catazus after her mother gained freedom. So Dorotea gained manumission, but not her daughter Caridad. And this brings us to the second stage of the story, Caridad's own legal fight for manumission, which not only drew on the outcome of Dorotea's case, but also pushed its rhetorical and legal strategies further. Okay, so 2 years later, in 1856, Caridad initiated her own petition for freedom with the then síndico procurador, Francisco Mancebo, as you see here. Mancebo initially attempted to solve the issue through a demanda de conciliación or a conciliation claim, but Melchor Catazus, the defendant, declined to respond. So the subsequent legal step was to open a civil suit, which is what happened. So just to identify all the parties involved in this case. So we have 15-year-old Caridad, the petitioner, who was represented by Francisco Mancebo, the síndico procurador, along with his hombre bueno or legal aid, José Chacón. And they were suing Melchor Catazus, the defendant, who in turn was represented by his own attorney. Both parties repeatedly referred to Caridad's mother, Dorotea's case, presenting opposing arguments by using her case as a precedent of sorts. And at the center of the dispute was Dorotea's original enslaver, Julián Maigret, his will in particular, and the way that he phrased his will, about the way Dorotea appears in his will, so to speak. So if Dorotea's case, as I said, rested on the presumed affection that Julián Maigret felt towards her as his slave, leading him to conditionally manumit her after his death, in Caridad's case, this affection became even more significant. Francisco Mancebo, the síndico representing Caridad, would argue that, in fact, Dorotea was already free from the moment in which Julián Maigret passed away. Consequently, Caridad, who had been conceived and born after his death, would also be free by birth, following the partes principle, right? So in other words, according to her petition, Caridad was never supposed to be enslaved because her mother Dorotea had been free since Julián Maigret passed. Caridad's síndico introduces a rather unexpected argument to make this claim, grounded not in conventional legal reasoning, but in the linguistic nuance of a single word in the will's phrasing. And this is going to be my focus. So this particular clause of the will was cited at least 6 times in the petition. So I'm going to just read it once, just so you know what I'm talking about. And I'm going to read the Spanish, but you have the translation into English right there on the right. So this is the clause of Julián Maigret's will that the lawyers cite over and over again. Es de mi voluntad que la negra Dorotea quede como de la propiedad de mi legítimo hijo Don Juan durante arriba la mayor edad, esto es, mientras cumple la edad de 25 años. Dorotea logrará tal gracia siempre que observe buena conducta y reputación, pues de lo contrario pasará al cuerpo de mis bienes y por consiguiente no tendrá entonces solo mi hijo Don Juan la propiedad de mi esclava, sino que pasará a dominio de todos mis herederos. So Mancebo, he argues that Julián Maigret, the deceased, had intended for Dorotea to remain como de la propiedad of his son, not his actual property, like the property. The difference here lies in the analogy, like property, or as if she were property. And continue with this reasoning, Mancebo says, salta a la vista que el testador no la dejó de la propiedad, sino como de la propiedad de este, frase que de ninguna manera determina la traslación de dominio, mucho menos después que se considera que sacó esa especie del cuerpo de sus bienes y se ve que solo le preocupó la idea de que Dorotea observara buena conducta y reputación, único caso en que de lo contrario había de quedar, no como especie de Juan Bautista Maigret, sino de sus herederos, etcétera, etcétera. So Mancebo contends that Julián Maigret's intention was not to transfer full ownership of Dorotea to his son, but to establish a relationship only analogous to ownership. The key term here, as you can see, is como, which is in the original is in capital letters, as is on the quotation on the slide. And Mancebo identifies this particle, como, following a grammarian, a 19th century grammarian, Vicente Salvá, as an adverb of manner that introduces a comparison or simile. So in his Gramática de la Lengua Castellana from 1847, Salvá writes that como, the partícula como, generally denotes the manner in which something is or is done, or the similarity or relationship that exists between two objects. Thus, it serves as a basis for all comparison. So according to Mancebo, this comparison was the sentido verdadero, or the true sense, the true meaning that Julián Maigret intended in his will. And to illustrate this interpretive stake of the particle como, or like, Mancebo proposes a linguistic exercise. He proposes to remove como from a sentence to assess how the meaning of the sentence changes. And he offers an example that in his view would be clear to all Spaniards, todos los españoles, he says. He proposes that we analyze the difference between San Agustín era una lumbrera de la iglesia y San Agustín es como una lumbrera de la iglesia. So the former, San Agustín, was a beacon of the church, asserts identity, right? While the latter, San Agustín, is like a beacon of the church, asserts a sort of a comparison, right? It resembles a beacon of the church. And this is the difference that Mancebo claims exists in Dorotea's legal status. Her enslavement, he argues, was not literal, but comparative. She was treated as if she were property. And of course, just a parenthesis here, St. Augustine was never literally a beacon. The comparison is clearly metaphorical here, even without the como. While in Dorotea's case, by contrast, there is no room for a metaphorical reading of the clause que Dorotea quede esclava de Maigret, right? Because by positive law, enslaved subjects were considered properties of their enslavers. Mancebo recognized this distinction, asserting that slave and property were synonyms. I'm going to quote just the second paragraph here. En la primera oración, Dorotea queda esclava de Maigret. Dorotea es tal, es positivamente esclava de Maigret. En la segunda, Dorotea quede como sierva de Maigret, es solamente a manera de cuál sierva o cuál de la propiedad, que es lo mismo. Mancebo suggests here the potential of an alternative manifestation of a master-slave relationship grounded in what he's going to call as affection. The notion that Dorotea's enslavement was a rhetorical device or a figure of speech, a simile, just like the St. Augustine example. Mancebo is then proposing sort of a radical reading here, that Dorotea's actual legal status was freedom and her enslavement was some sort of rhetorical illusion or some sort of legal fiction, a simile that veiled the reality of her free condition. So we have this is the side of the petitioner, the side of the Dorotea's representative. That's his argument. Melchor Catazuz, the defendant, has his own lawyer, José Godoy, who, as one would expect, rebuts Mancebo's proposition. And he does so in two ways. First, with sarcasm, he responds to Mancebo's reference to Spanish grammar by stating that Julián Maigret was born in Santo Domingo and was a native speaker of French, was not familiar with all the meanings of the partícula como. That's what he says. But Godoy's main rebuttal abandons linguistic theory in favor of a lived reality. Dorotea, he insists, lived as a slave under Maigret's control, regardless of any sort of grammatical nuances. The particle como, or like, then, serves for him as a conduit for simile that goes in the opposite direction. And I'm just going to quote this briefly, and also in the original, the words are underlined as well on the document. ¿Cómo se concilia el derecho de propiedad sobre un individuo que tiene y goza el derecho de la libertad? ¿Podrá vivir como libre el que queda sujeto a los caprichos de otro que le tiene y posee como cosa de su propiedad? Here, Godoy uses como twice, or three times actually. First, to answer whether someone can live as free, under domination, and then to stress that Dorotea was treated como cosa de su propiedad, like a piece of property. In doing so, he turns the particle against Mancebo, the síndico, using it to underscore the gap between rhetorical analogy and experienced subjugation, so her lived reality. And this goes on for a while, right? And what is interesting, though, is that in the end, the judge sides with Mancebo, and in his ruling, he affirms the significance of como as what he calls adverbio bonificativo, and he notes, considerando, this is what's on the slide as well, considerando que al extender el testador la referida cláusula novena en que una y otra parte fundan su reclamación, uso el adverbio modificativo como, que indica la manera, estableciendo una comparación, porque no es la cosa misma, sino una semejanza de ella. It's not the thing itself, but a likeness of it. For he had intended to leave her as a slave with all the consequences of her status, he would not have used that adverbial expression. So here, the judge's understanding is that there was an intention behind the phrasing of the will, right? And this is important. And this interpretation transforms the clause from a statement of ownership into an expression of resemblance. And as a result, the judge concludes that Juan Bautista Megret was not Dorotea's owner, but her usufructuario. I'm not going to go deep into this because that's a different kind of discussion. But as usufructuario was the person granted temporary use of property that still belonged to another. And he cites the Law 23, Title 31 of the third partida. So the siete partidas come here to play, which held that children of siervos belonged not to usufructuaries, but to the original owner. So then the judge further rules that Caridad, who was born after Megret's death, had never belonged to Juan Bautista or to Melchor Catazuz, who claimed to have purchased her. So I'm not going to read this quote in full, but this is what he's saying, right? He's saying that Juan Bautista was just the usufructuario, the usufructuary of Dorotea, not her actual owner. So besides agreeing with the syndico regarding the particle como, however, the judge adds another interpretive layer to this linguistic conundrum that justified Julián Megret's choice of phrasing, affection. According to the judge, it was the affection that Julián Megret held or professed towards Dorotea that led him to phrase his testament as an analogy, thus establishing that Dorotea would not be owned by Juan Bautista, but that she would be like his property. And I'm just going to read what is on bold. And taking into account the testator's will regarding Dorotea's freedom and the reasons supporting it based on the affection he professed for her as she was born under his ownership, por haber nacido en su poder. And in the original Spanish, he uses the word en la que la apoya del cariño que le profesaba. And cariño was, at that point, it meant amor, benevolencia, o afecto, so love, benevolence, or affection, which, according to the judge, Megret professed towards Dorotea. So for the judge, this emotional bond, this imagined emotional bond born within the asymmetrical power structure of slavery, por haber nacido en su poder, explain the testator's choice of analogy. And I see here as kind of a weird paradox, right? Was it this insidious form of affection that was rooted in ownership, rooted in the fact that she was property that enabled Caridad's freedom. A cariño that produced a relationship akin to slavery, but not legally identical to it, according to the judge. So before I get to the conclusion of this analysis, I would like to address some of very important, I think, caveats of this case and my approach to it. So first, of course, Caridad's successful petition for manumission cannot be considered representative of most freedom suits in Cuba in the 19th century. I'm still in the process of parsing through many dozens of suits like this, but what I can say so far is that most of the petitions that I have encountered are not like this, right? They are different. They don't all rely on this sort of legal close reading as this one does. And I say legal close reading because it is very much what Mancebo, the Síndico Procurador, is doing here, which makes me wonder about the difference between kind of a legal analysis and a literary analysis, which is in here becomes very blurred. So this is a problem of scale. That is the first caveat, right? Given that the exceptionality of this case and the fact that, as I mentioned, that it was litigated in Santiago de Cuba and not Havana, what can Caridad's freedom suit tell us about the genre of freedom suit as a whole and about the lives of enslaved peoples in mid-19th century Cuba? Or even about their relationship with the legal sphere? This is a question that I have that is still open-ended question for myself, for everybody. The second caveat has to do with who, in fact, is speaking here. Who is making this argument about the como, about the particle como, and about the analogy? All the demandas and tréplicas, so everything that has been written is signed by Francisco Mancebo, not by Caridad. So I cannot claim that it is Caridad who is speaking here directly, right? So it's a question of voice here. Nevertheless, this case, and this is where I think can take the biggest takeout from this. This case points to the possibilities and modalities of freedom that were available to enslaved subjects through the very mechanisms that enforced their enslavements, law and affect. And such possibilities, as demonstrated by this particular lawsuit, arise from the analogical character that, I contend, is inherent in the institution of chattel slavery in the Americas. And this brings me back to one of the interventions that I mentioned early on in the talk about the matter of commodification versus personhood under enslavement. And I said that since the late 18th century, the prevailing notion has been that enslaved peoples were turned into commodities. And this was an emphasis of reformist and abolitionist rhetoric, as well as pro-slavery rhetoric. And that contemporary scholarship sometimes reproduces this sort of rhetoric as well, but also there has been very much a subject of contention. And I would argue that it's precisely the ontological instability of the figure of the slave, not quite property because human, but treated as property because enslaved, that which Caridad and Mancebo explored in this lawsuit. And I'm putting both of them here because one is representing the other. So by allowing for the possibility of a situation analogous to slavery, but not literal enslavement, it becomes unclear what exactly something like slavery or like property would look like. If the analogy involves a comparison, then what aspects of enslavement and Dorothea's status are being juxtaposed here? What exactly is being compared? Without diving too much into speculation, we can perhaps reasonably assume that in Dorothea's daily life, there was not that much of a distinction between her theoretical freedom or unfreedom after Julián Megret died. And this is the third caveat, right? What actually changed in her life to be como de la propiedad and not actual property as the sentence ruled? However, and this is what I'm concluding here, it is the open-ended analogy in her enslaver's testament, that allowed for retroactive differentiation between being property and like property of the heir. And this conceptual difference, I think, that is what facilitated a shift that fundamentally and materially changed Dorothea's and Caridad's lives from then on, right? So I think my biggest takeaway here is that the blurriness between slavery and freedom here it's the instability of this property status is such that a syntactical close reading like this one, right, allowed for the kind of openness or the revelation of this instability, which is not something that enslavers wanted at the time. And I think I will stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions or or criticisms or anything that we can talk about anything. Thank you so much.
Bravo. Thank you, Isabella. We have a number of questions coming in. We invite more. Send us your questions. I'm going to start with just an observation, and you can pick up on it. Freedom suits and who brought them and how they brought them, and especially down to your level of analysis of the word como, like, allows us to really think about that blurriness, the ambiguity between the status of slave and free. There's a tendency always in the study of slavery to see it as either or, either or, either or. That leads me to, and I'd love to hear you comment more on that, but then it leads me to ask just simply, what do we know about the scale of freedom suits in that period in Brazil? How many were there? And hence it helps perhaps to speculate at least about the courage, the impulse of Dorothea and Caridad, her daughter, to even try this. I mean, how many were there? Or does anyone know? Is there a sense of the scale of it? And can you comment on just how enslaved people use that ambiguity to exploit it, to try to find, a status of free?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's an important question, and I think the answer that I'm still working on in terms of the quantitative aspect, I think people have been working on this, and I want to mention Adriana Tira's book, which is a wonderful book, and she focuses on the freedom suits on the eastern portion of Cuba, which were fewer, right? As I said, much fewer than Havana, and because of this distance, and this is her part of her argument, this political, ideological, economic, material distance between Havana and Santiago, it allowed for a less, I guess, some discontinuation between the social sphere and the legal sphere to be more organic, I guess. This is part of what she says. So I think there is a specificity of the freedom suits that were litigated there in Santiago de Cuba versus the ones that were litigated in Havana. I'm working right now with a little bit of both, with some suits that were litigated in Havana, some suits that were litigated in Santiago. But what I can say about the quantitative, like the quantitative aspects, that there were not many. There were maybe the ones that I have are maybe dozens. There were a lot that have been lost in the National Archive. And I was there recently, and there were some that had been lost, but they existed that we know, right? But still, I think the quantitative aspect is important, but I think the rhetoric that this one uses, right? It shows precisely that the law was not this not explicit, but this fixed technical realm that was so separated from the litigants themselves, and that's why they needed the syndicos, right, the representatives. It was actually something that was way more malleable than one would expect, right? And I think this is the interesting aspect for my research in particular, because it was this malleability that allowed for the intervention sometimes of this matter of feeling, right, of this imagined perverse affection between enslaver and enslaved that they projected, right? It was used in both directions, sometimes to affirm to affirm the manumission, right, to grant manumission and to deny manumission, right? So I think feeling here, the affection that I see on this suit appears in many others, and it was used in different ways. I don't know if that answers fully your questions, right?
I think
Just ripping out.
People have begun to find the same sort of thing in American South.
Yeah.
Using the ambiguity of this status and the relationship with the owner as a way of suing for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. There's a question here about why you chose to compare Cuba and Brazil, these two huge slave regions of the Caribbean and South America. Why the comparison, and how is it? And I misspoke earlier. I said Brazil, I meant Cuba.
Yeah, no, I see. Sometimes I confuse that myself. I think
how does that help the study? Is it more sources in Brazil, or?
I think it depends, because this project is so varied in terms of the sources that I tackle. So you have this one chapter is the legal discourse. I have some criminal suits and mostly freedom suits, but some others are medical dissertations and medical theses. So the amount of material that I'm going to find in each territory is going to vary depending on the chapter. But I would just say, though, that I don't think, at least I hope, or my goal is not to compare Brazil and Cuba per se, right? Is to maybe tell parallel stories and to find points of intersection between those stories that sometimes are concrete material, but sometimes are more ideological or theoretical, or that I create, right, in my own analysis. So I don't think I'm doing, while Cuba was like this, Brazil was like that. I don't think that's my goal, even though I find that super interesting, but that's not necessarily what I'm doing here. I think I'm trying to tell a story that connects these two territories, these two histories, in ways that I think are productive to think about the ways people dealt with freedom and slavery in the 19th century.
Sure. Well, the one and only Stuart Schwartz just weighed in.
Yes, thank you. This is helpful to know.
Only Stuart could, and let us know that in a study of Bahia in Brazil, before 1850, no more than 1% were ever manumitted, which tells us a lot.
Yeah, I think in Santiago it was a bit more, but yeah.
Okay, all right. Tim Weeks here wants to know, how would Dorothea have financed her lawsuit?
That's a good question. In this particular suit, I don't know. It doesn't say. In some of the others, they had their own funds. They were able to finance them. Sometimes they would sort of crowdfund, so ask for funding from their own communities.
Sure.
And sometimes the syndico would also help with that, but not always. But in this case, I have no information about how Dorothea managed to do this herself. I have to, at least in her suit, it doesn't say.
Yeah, I think there's ambiguity about that too.
Yeah.
South. How did people go to the law without any money?
Yeah.
Sarah Moody is asking about I think she's really asking about this almost slavery status.
Mhm.
Uh, in some cultures, it was called quasi-slavery.
Mhm.
Is it really that, an almost slavery status, or is it a in-between status? Especially once you got into court.
Right.
What is that relationship to feeling?
So, right. I think what she's asking if this is like the patronato. I think this is earlier, right? So Julian Megret died in the late 40s, early 50s, I think. So that was before patronato. And maybe this was something, this is representative of of a more like a conceptual shift that was happening. I can't claim that, right? But it is, I think, something that was already imbued in the way people thought about slavery. And the way I think it's interesting because the case ends up being a lot about what his intention was in writing the will like that. So why did he write with this particular clause, the como propiedad de, right? This is what both sides were trying to understand. But of course, what I'm trying to argue here is that it's less about what he wanted as the as the owner, right? Or what he wanted as the will, the will writer, and more about what it could be done with that phrasing afterwards, right? I think that's what matters the most to me. Even though the way that this has been read by the lawyers was more about what Julian Megret wanted, right? I'm more interested in how this particular clause was interpreted, or how it was manipulated, interpreted, yeah.
Sure. Well, Sarah also weighs in and gives us indeed a definition. Patronato, she said, is defined or translated as apprenticeship, which is interesting because apprenticeship is yet another kind of status. It certainly was a status used at the for abolition in the British and French, and I don't know to what degree in the Spanish Empire.
What was the question exactly? Sorry.
Well, I don't think that is a question.
Okay.
She's giving patronato the definition or translation of apprenticeship.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, because yes, I am talking about an earlier, like decades before the patronato. That's what I wanted to say.
I wanted to get you to reflect, if possible, a little bit on this, and this is a very old question in slavery studies, whether North America, South America, Caribbean, or elsewhere. Just how do we get to the interior world of enslaved people, enslavers themselves? How do we get there? That's a question that goes way back in slavery studies. How can we understand the psychology of enslavement? In this case, you're using legal records, right? I mean, as an access. Are there other ways in the whole of your book? Or are you, as a good scholar, connected to where you have documented evidence? Because the interior world of anybody is not that easy to access, but we certainly have been trying to do it for decades and decades in this field. How do you come to think about that? When do you feel like you're really getting access to this interior world?
I don't think I ever am, honestly.
Dorothea or her daughter. I don't.
Yeah, I don't think that's possible. But okay, let me start. But in this particular chapter, I don't think we are accessing anything of Dorothea's or Caridad's interiority, right? As I said, we are reading the writing of their legal representatives.
Right.
And it's really, I cannot say to which extent is they're actually intervening in the way this is being litigated. That said, what my project is doing is not necessarily trying to access itself with the interiority of enslaved people's minds, but to understand how this interiority was conceived as such, as interiority. So how this idea of the enslaved person's mind was conceived by themselves and by their enslavers, right? How would people imagine that enslaved people thought and felt and had inner worlds, right? And how that idea of an inner world participated in the way slavery existed and happened as such. I think I'm more interested in the ways this interiority is imagined or is projected or is thought of more than accessing myself that interiority, which I don't think it's I don't believe in that possibility that much, right? I do work with the writings of enslaved peoples themselves, and this is what one would claim is one way of accessing it, right? But those writings are themselves written in moments of constraint. They are written in moments in situations of coercion that one may even, or mediation even, right? That one may even ask, how much are we actually accessing, right? So I think I try to avoid the question of access and think more about invention or imagination and projection. Does that make sense?
Yeah, fair enough. Can you read the Reginald Jackson question? It seems to be quite a literary question.
Yeah.
And he's asking, first of all, big compliments to your presentation, but he's thinking about other spaces, he says, that might be dramatized by imaginative literature.
Mm-hmm.
He's referring to a book by Nicole Wright. I don't know the book, you may. I'm not sure what he's exactly asking about the use of British novels, but is there a literary framework of some kind?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If those litigations were ever appear in literature or theater, I am not aware of an example at this point, Reginald, but that's a great question. I can't recall any example right now, so I would say that was not common, but this is something that I should probably look closely into. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great question.
You know, you brought up the idea of the writings of former slaves themselves. How big was the tradition of a slave narrative, for example, in, let's say, Brazil, because it was so big?
Not common at all. I think this is
That's what I've always learned, as opposed to, well, and even in North America, we never had more than 100 to 120 published slave narratives, small, large, big, famous or not. Those certainly became a kind of access to the psychology of former slaves, but Brazil doesn't have
There are autobiographical texts about the experience of enslavement, yes. And I work with one of them, Luis Gama, who was an Afro-Brazilian lawyer and abolitionist towards the end of the 19th century. He also had been enslaved, and he writes a short text that was a letter about his life as an enslaved boy, actually. But that doesn't really fall into the hermeneutics of the slave narrative as we understand it in the Anglo world. There are a lot of, I mean, I don't know if she's here, but Agnes Lucrative is my former advisor and friend. She also thinks about that. And in our conversations, one thing that she mentioned once was precisely the fact that there was the importance of the legal sphere for enslaved peoples in the territories of Iberian colonization. That allowed for this kind of legal personality or legal representation that somehow did not reflect it in I guess, fewer examples of what we call slave narratives in this world. And I might be misquoting her here. We can talk more about that at some point. But it is an interesting phenomenon that there is not as many or very few. We have Manzano's narrative in Cuba, right, who was actually produced at the request of an Irish abolitionist. So it was first published in English, and then much later in Spanish, right? So it emerged already under a more of an Anglo-Saxon understanding of what a slave narrative is, even though it's a very different one.
Wow. Well, S.A. Ashtar here is asking really a similar question. How do you deal with the absence of such an archive of slave narratives, and nevertheless still search out the interiority of people? There are a few others here. I don't know. You know, Adi Van Dyke wants to ask about your use of the word favor. I'm not sure. I don't know.
I think this is the favor it's the words the word that appears in the documents themselves.
Right.
As if manumission was a favor granted by the enslaver. I think that's what it means.
Yeah. Could you give us at least a sense of the whole of your book? I mean, you focused on the law today, the chapter on law. I was intrigued with what you said about where you're taking this into the realm of anthropology.
Yeah, so it's at
The-
each
the
chapter. I think I
overall arc
mentioned
of
it in
your-
the beginning, but my slides weren't working.
All right, that's all right.
No, yeah, it was nobody's fault. So the first I start with this moment of the late 18th century when, you know, with the expansion of the slave trade to
Right.
both Cuba and Brazil, and that's when I identified this shift. Or I guess the shift to that a moment in which this idea of feeling permeates those societies, and this is where the enslaved who have always been a subject of the Catholic Church, right? So endowed with the soul, becomes their interiority exists in a more secular way, I would say, or maybe not that secular, but it appears also in different kinds of discourses. So the first chapter is about medical discourse and how medical discourse engages with this idea of an enslaved mind. So I focus on the illness of nostalgia as an illness that afflicted enslaved peoples, and how that allowed for this interrogation about the inner lives of enslaved peoples. And then the second chapter is about literature. So that's when I look into the writings of enslaved poets in particular, and how they engaged with this idea of feeling as this very prized human capacity. And then the third chapter is the one about the law, and this one that I briefly talked about. And then I ended the book with this aftermath of abolition in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when the discourses are shifting, right? So there is this new interest of anthropology and psychiatry over the psyches of newly freed peoples. So yeah, it's a very long durée kind of argument.
But that psychiatric take, if
Mhm.
that's what it became, you said it landed on ideas about madness and dysfunction and the damages of slavery and all of that. That might be a heck of a way to take this book out. I was also curious if you're using any information sources from the world of religious conversion. That is, I don't know. There have been studies, for example, of the Moravian missionaries in parts of the Caribbean, and the remarkable success they had with, I guess, Christian conversion.
Yeah.
Detailed records of what people said to them.
Yes.
I don't know if that's
yeah, I don't work
available.
with those narratives. I teach those, but I don't work. I think they come from a very different historical context that I think that would complicate even more my already very complicated project. But those are very, very interesting. Yes, there are a few, I think exactly a Moravian narrative that is fascinating, that I'm blanking on his name, but he portrays his conversion as a sort of like shift of ownership from his enslaver to God, so he becomes enslaved to God. So this is also a very fascinating writing.
A lot of those narratives or whatever they end up being called, interviews, are about spirituality.
Yes, yes.
Essentially. Okay. Well, people want to know when your book's coming out.
Good question.
Every time out there, folks. Want a couple of years. Took your first job. I mean, yeah. Well, this is great. What a great subject. A difficult subject, but nobody ever said this topic or this field should be easy. But bless you, Isabella, for trying to reach this, well, at least in some form, this interior world of enslaved people, millions in the case of Brazil and nearly millions in the case of Cuba as well. Well, okay. Thank you. And
thank you so much. Thank you for all the questions. I think Akhtar's question is a very important one. Oh, take that one with me. Thank you all. Thank you, David.
Well, we have all the questions documented here. You can still get them from us. Anyway, thank you all for attending today. I think we'll be back on next week with another, and probably the last of this year's GLC at lunch. And again, Isabella, thank you.
In fact, this is the last GLC at lunch.
Oh, it is the last? Oh, I thought we had another one next week. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. This is our finale, and thank you, Isabella, and good luck in the Yale libraries.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.